October 27th, 1962. The Caribbean Sea. The water is calm, deceptively peaceful, hiding a tension so thick it could choke the breath from a man's lungs. Beneath the surface, somewhere in the deep blue shadows, a Soviet diesel-electric submarine is running silent. Its batteries are nearly dead. The air inside is so thick with carbon dioxide that the crew is gasping for every breath. The temperature is soaring past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They have been hunted for days. They do not know where they are. They do not know if war has already begun. And above them, 4 American destroyers are circling like sharks. They are dropping depth charges. Not nuclear ones, just practice charges. Small explosions meant to signal, meant to harass, meant to force the submarine to the surface. But down in the steel belly of the Soviet boat, those explosions sound like the beginning of the end. They sound like war. The captain of the submarine believes his country is already under attack. He believes he has the authority to launch a nuclear torpedo, a single weapon capable of vaporizing a fleet and potentially triggering a global exchange that would end civilization. The American captains above do not know this. They think they are chasing a conventional submarine. They think they are playing a game of cat and mouse. They do not know that every depth charge they drop brings the world closer to incineration. This is the story of how a misunderstanding, a lack of communication, and the heat of the moment almost turned a routine naval harassment into the spark that lit the fuse of World War III. This is the story of Black Saturday. This is the story of how a USA destroyer almost started a nuclear war. To understand the gravity of that moment, we must step back and look at the world as it stood in late October 1962. The Cold War was not just cold, it was freezing, a stalemate of ideology and arsenals, where every move was counted, every whisper was analyzed, and every shadow was suspected of hiding a missile. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a dance of mutual assured destruction. Both sides had enough nuclear weapons to wipe the other off the map multiple times over. But in Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, the balance had shifted. American intelligence had discovered Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles being installed on the island. For President John F. Kennedy, this was an unacceptable threat. It changed the strategic calculus instantly. Missiles in Cuba could reach Washington, D.C. in minutes, removing the warning time that the United States relied upon. Kennedy announced a naval quarantine of Cuba. A blockade, though they could not call it that legally. Any Soviet ship attempting to breach the line would be stopped. The world held its breath. Soviet ships approaching the line stopped or turned back. But there was one element of the Soviet deployment that the Americans did not know about. It was not just the missiles on land. It was the submarines in the water. The Soviet Union had sent a group of Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarines to support the operation in Cuba. These were not the sleek nuclear hunters of later years. They were conventional boats, reliant on diesel engines on the surface and batteries underwater. They were noisy. They were slow when submerged. And they were vulnerable. The American Navy knew submarines were in the area, but their intelligence was incomplete. They did not know how many. They did not know their specific capabilities. And crucially, they did not know that these submarines were carrying nuclear torpedoes. The T-5 nuclear torpedo was a secret weapon. It had a yield comparable to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It was designed to take out an entire aircraft carrier group with a single shot. The authorization to use it was complex. In theory, It required approval from Moscow. But in the chaos of war, with communications cut, the rules were ambiguous. The captains on the scene were given discretion. If they believed war had started, if they believed their submarine was about to be destroyed, they could use the weapon. This discretion was the loaded gun on the table. And on October 27th, the hand was hovering over the trigger. The day began with tension, already at a breaking point. An American U-2 spy plane had been shot down over Cuba earlier that day, killing the pilot. Another U-2 had strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia. In Washington, the executive committee was debating an invasion of Cuba. In Moscow, Khrushchev was receiving conflicting reports, fearing an American first strike. The sea was the only place where the two superpowers were physically touching, hull to hull, sonar to sonar. The U.S. Navy had established a barrier of destroyers and aircraft to track any Soviet submarines attempting to enter the quarantine zone. They used sonar buoys and magnetic anomaly detectors. They were looking for contacts, and they found one, designated B-59. The American destroyers moved in. There were 4 of them. The USS Coney was leading the hunt, supported by others including the USS Beale and the USS Murray. They were backed by the aircraft carrier USS Randolph. From the American perspective, this was standard procedure. Identify the contact, force it to surface, verify its identity, make it leave the area. It was a game of pressure. Drop a small depth charge, wait for a reaction. If the sub stays down, drop another. It was harassment, yes, but it was within the rules of engagement as the Americans understood them. They were not trying to kill the submarine. They were trying to talk to it, in the only language submarines understood when submerged. But inside B-59, the language was being interpreted very differently. The submarine had been out of contact with Moscow for days. The radio antennas could not receive signals while submerged at depth. To communicate, they had to rise to periscope depth, extend the antenna, and hope they could catch a transmission without being detected. But the American destroyers were right on top of them. Every time they tried to rise, the sonar pinged them back down. They were trapped. The air conditioning had failed. The tropical heat of the Caribbean was penetrating the steel hull. Inside, the temperature was unbearable. Men were fainting from the heat and the lack of oxygen. The carbon dioxide levels were critical. The crew was exhausted. They had been on high alert for weeks. And now, explosions were rocking the hull. To the American sailors on the destroyers, these were signaling charges, small bangs. But to the Soviet crew, deep underwater, sound travels differently. The explosions reverberated through the water and into the hull like hammer blows. They sounded like combat depth charges. They sounded like an attempt to crush the submarine like a tin can. Captain Valentin Savitsky of B-59 was a man under immense pressure. He was responsible for his boat, his crew, and his weapon. He had not heard from Moscow in days. He did not know if war had started. When the depth charges began hitting the water, his instinct was not of a man being harassed, but of a man being attacked. In his mind, the war had already begun. The Americans were trying to destroy him. If he was being destroyed, he had to make a choice. Surrender and surface, potentially exposing his country's secret weapon and facing capture, or fight back. He had the nuclear torpedo. He had the authority, or so he believed, to use it if the submarine was about to be destroyed. He called a meeting with his senior officers. Among them was the political officer, Ivan Maslenikov. Maslenikov was the eyes of the Communist Party on the boat. His word carried immense weight. He agreed with Savitsky The situation was critical. They were under attack. They should launch the nuclear torpedo. This was not just a tactical decision. It was a strategic one. A nuclear explosion underwater near the U.S. fleet would destroy the ships. It would kill hundreds of American sailors. And it would be interpreted by Washington as a nuclear first strike. The response would be immediate. Bombers would launch. Missiles would fly. The chain reaction would be unstoppable. But there was a third man in that room, Vasily Arkhipov. He was the captain of the flotilla, essentially the senior officer among the submarine commanders, though he was aboard B-59 as an observer. He was not the captain of this specific boat, but his rank was higher. He was calm. He was experienced. He listened to Savitsky's rage. He listened to Maslenikov's insistence. And he disagreed. He argued that the explosions were not an attack. They were signals. He argued that surfacing was the only logical choice. If war had started, launching one torpedo would not save them. It would only ensure their deaths and the deaths of millions back home. He urged restraint. He urged them to follow protocol, surface, identify themselves, wait for orders. The argument was heated. The air in the room was as thick as the air in the submarine. Savitsky was furious. He felt humiliated by the American harassment. He felt the honor of the Soviet Navy was at stake. But Arkhipov stood firm. He was the only one who could veto the launch. The protocol required the agreement of 3 key officers: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander. Savitsky had 2. Arkhipov was the 3rd. Without his signature, the torpedo could not be launched. In that sweltering room, with the depth charges still thumping against the hull, Arkhipov saved the world. He talked Savitsky down. He convinced him to surface. Meanwhile, on the USS Coney, the American captain was watching his sonar screens. He was frustrated. The submarine was not responding. He ordered more depth charges. He did not know he was pushing a man toward the brink of nuclear launch. He did not know that the submarine below him had the power to sink his ship and every ship around him in a flash of nuclear fire. He was operating on the assumption that this was a conventional submarine trying to hide. He was following his orders to force contact. There was no malice in his actions. There was no desire for war. There was only the procedure of naval warfare. This is the terrifying nature of the incident. It was not a villain plotting destruction. It was a series of misunderstandings. The Americans did not know about the nuclear torpedoes. The Soviets did not know the depth charges were harmless signals. Both sides were operating in the dark, guided by fear and protocol. If Arkhipov had not been on that boat, if he had agreed with Savitsky, the history of the world would be different. There would be no us to tell this story. The city of Washington might be a memory. The Cold War would have turned hot in the Caribbean Sea. When B-59 finally surfaced, it was night. The hatch opened. The fresh air rushed in. The American destroyers surrounded them. Floodlights blinded the Soviet crew. Machine guns were pointed at the bridge. It was a tense standoff, but the shooting did not start. The Soviets had chosen not to fire. The Americans chose not to board aggressively. They signaled the submarine to follow them. B-59, battered and hot, followed the American ships out of the quarantine zone. They were escorted away. The immediate crisis was over, but the danger had not fully passed. The Americans still did not know what they had narrowly escaped. It would take decades for the truth to come out. For years, historians believed the submarines were just carrying conventional torpedoes. It was not until a conference in Havana in 2002, 40 years later, that the surviving participants revealed the truth. Vasily Arkhipov was there. So were some of the American officers. When the Americans heard that the submarine had been armed with a nuclear torpedo and that the crew had been ready to launch, they were stunned. They realized how close they had come. They realized that their practiced depth charges had almost triggered the apocalypse. The role of the US destroyers in this incident is often overlooked. History remembers Arkhipov. It remembers Kennedy and Khrushchev. It remembers the U-2 pilot who was shot down. But it rarely remembers the captains of the destroyers. They were doing their jobs. They were enforcing a quarantine. They were protecting their country from what they perceived as a threat. They were not reckless. They were following the rules of a game that everyone hoped would remain a game. But the rules were incomplete. There was no direct hotline between the destroyers and the submarine. There was no way to say, "We are not attacking. Please, surface." There was only the language of explosives. This lack of communication channel was the real enemy. It was the gap where disaster almost slipped through. The incident highlighted the need for better protocols. It contributed to the establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline shortly after the crisis. It showed that in the nuclear age, ambiguity is dangerous. Clarity is survival. Think about the psychology of the men on the USS Connie. They were young. Many were conscripts or junior officers. They were trained to fight. They were trained to protect the fleet. When they dropped those depth charges, they felt they were being professional. They were asserting dominance. They were showing the Soviets that they could not hide in American waters. They did not feel like they were playing with fire. They felt like they were controlling the situation. This is the banality of near extinction. It does not always look like a button being pressed in a bunker. Sometimes it looks like a routine patrol. Sometimes it looks like a captain ordering a signaling charge. The horror of the Cold War was not just in the weapons, but in the normalcy with which those weapons were managed. Men slept on submarines with nuclear torpedoes. Men dropped explosives on those submarines while eating lunch. The margin for error was zero. And on October 27th, the error margin was breached. The only thing that held the line was the judgment of one man in a hot submarine, and the luck that the Americans did not escalate further when the sub surfaced. The technical details of the encounter revealed just how precarious the situation was. The Foxtrot-class submarines were noisy. They were easily detected by American sonar. This was why they were hunted so effectively. The Americans knew exactly where they were. The Soviets knew they were known. This created a pressure cooker environment. The Soviet captain knew he could not escape. He knew he was trapped. When you trap a wounded animal, it bites. When you trap a nuclear submarine, it launches. The American destroyers had anti-submarine warfare capabilities that were superior to the Soviet evasion capabilities. They had helicopters. They had sonar buoys. They had coordination. The Soviet sub was alone. It was isolated. This imbalance of power contributed to Savitsky's frustration. He felt powerless. The nuclear torpedo was his equalizer. It was the only card he had to play that mattered. If he used it, he would lose his life. But he would take the enemy with him. This is the logic of deterrence. But deterrence only works if the other side knows you have the weapon. Since the Americans did not know, the deterrence failed. The pressure continued. The only thing that stopped the launch was internal discipline. The aftermath of the crisis led to changes in both navies. The Soviet Union became more cautious about deploying nuclear weapons on submarines without strict communication links. The United States revised its anti-submarine warfare protocols to account for the possibility of nuclear-armed targets. They realized that forcing a submarine to surface with depth charges was a high-risk strategy if the submarine had nuclear capabilities. But these lessons came after the fact. They came after the world had already spun on its axis and nearly fallen off. The men involved lived with this knowledge. The American captains went on with their careers, never knowing until 40 years later that they had been inches from Armageddon. Imagine living your life thinking you did your duty, only to find out your duty almost ended humanity. The weight of that revelation must have been immense. For Arkhipov, the weight was different. He knew what he had done. He knew he had said no when everyone else said yes. He never received public recognition during his lifetime. He died in obscurity. It was only after the documents were declassified that the world learned his name. He is sometimes called the man who saved the world. But he was just a man doing his job. He was just a man who kept his head when others lost theirs. The story of the U.S. destroyer and the Soviet submarine is a microcosm of the entire Cold War. It was a conflict fought in the shadows. It was a conflict where mistakes were costly. It was a conflict where communication was the most valuable weapon of all. The destroyers represented the pressure of the West. The submarine represented the secrecy of the East. When they collided, not physically but psychologically, the spark nearly flew. We live in a different time now. The Cold War is over, but the lessons remain. Nuclear weapons still exist. Submarines still patrol the oceans. Misunderstandings still happen. The technology has changed, but the human element remains the same. Fear, pride, exhaustion, and confusion are still the drivers of conflict. The story of B-59 and the U.S. destroyers is a warning. It reminds us that peace is fragile. It reminds us that protocols matter. It reminds us that one person's decision can echo through history. As we look back at that day, we must acknowledge the role of chance. If the sea had been rougher, if the sonar had been clearer, if the radio had worked, if Arkhipov had been on a different boat, so many variables had to align for disaster to be averted. It was not inevitable that peace would hold. It was a choice, a series of choices. The choice of Kennedy to quarantine rather than invade immediately. The choice of Khrushchev to eventually withdraw the missiles. The choice of Arkhipov to veto the launch. And the choice of the American destroyer captains to stop when the sub surfaced. Each link in the chain held. But if one link had broken, the chain would have snapped. The video you are watching is not just about history. It is about the present. It is about the systems we have in place today. Are they robust enough? Are the communication lines open? Are the people in charge capable of restraint? These are the questions that the story of October 27th demands we ask. The ocean keeps its secrets well. The depth charges sank to the bottom. The sound waves dissipated. The submarine returned to base. The destroyers returned to port. The world turned to Monday. But for a few hours on Saturday, the future hung in the balance. The American destroyer captain thought he was securing his nation. The Soviet submarine captain thought he was defending his nation. Both were right. Both were wrong. They were trapped in a system that valued strength over safety, secrecy over clarity. They were pawns in a game played by men in Washington and Moscow who were also guessing, also fearing, also struggling to control the forces they had unleashed. The nuclear genie was out of the bottle. And on that day, it nearly swallowed us all. We are here today because of the decisions made in that hot, dark submarine and on that rolling deck of a destroyer. We are here because of restraint. We are here because of luck. And we are here because sometimes, in the face of absolute pressure, humanity finds a way to pause. The technical specifications of the weapons involved tell part of the story. The Mark 44 torpedo used by the Americans was an anti-submarine weapon. It was designed to hunt and kill. The depth charges were small but effective at signaling. The Soviet T-5 nuclear torpedo was a different beast entirely. It was not designed for precision. It was designed for area denial. A single detonation would contaminate the water for years. It would kill everyone in the vicinity regardless of nationality. It was a weapon of last resort. But what defines last resort? Is it when you are sunk? Is it when you are under attack? Is it when you lose communication? The definition was mohu. It was open to interpretation, and in the heat of the moment, interpretation leans toward the worst-case scenario. Savitsky interpreted the depth charges as an attack. He was not irrational. He was reacting to the data he had. He had no data suggesting otherwise. He had no radio message saying, "This is a drill." He had explosions. In war, explosions mean attack. His logic was sound. His conclusion was catastrophic. This is the danger of automated systems and delegated authority. When you give men the power to end the world, you must ensure they have the information to use it wisely. On October 27th, they did not have the information. The role of the aircraft carrier, USS Randolph, is also worth noting. It was the flagship of the operation. It had aircraft ready to launch. If the submarine had fired a nuclear torpedo, the Randolph would have been a primary target. The loss of a carrier with a nuclear weapon would have been a casus belli of the highest order. It would have demanded retaliation. The escalation ladder would have been climbed rapidly. From submarine to surface fleet. From surface fleet to Air Force. From Air Force to strategic bombers. From strategic bombers to intercontinental ballistic missiles. The steps are short. The time is short. Once the first step is taken, it is hard to stop. The momentum of war is powerful. It pulls everyone into its gravity. The only way to stop it is to refuse to take the first step. Arkhipov refused. The American captains, upon seeing the subsurface, refused to fire. They held their fire. They waited. That pause was enough. That pause allowed the tension to bleed out. It allowed reason to return. It allowed the crisis to de-escalate. We often think of nuclear war as a button press in a silo. We think of it as cold, calculated, digital. But the reality is messy. It is human. It is sweaty men in a hot submarine arguing in the dark. It is tired sailors on a destroyer dropping cans of explosives into the sea. It is fear. It is pride. It is the inability to see the other side as human. The Americans saw the submarine as a target. The Soviets saw the destroyers as aggressors. Neither saw the individuals. They saw the uniform. They saw the flag. They saw the enemy. Dehumanization is the precursor to destruction. When you stop seeing the people on the other side, it becomes easier to kill them. The breakthrough came when the hatch opened. When the Soviets surfaced, they became visible. They became real. They were no longer a blip on a sonar screen. They were men. And it is harder to kill men, you can see. This visual confirmation helped break the cycle of violence. It forced a human connection, however tense. It reminded both sides that there were lives at stake. Not just abstract numbers, but fathers, sons, husbands. The legacy of this incident is mixed. On one hand, it is a triumph of survival. We made it through. On the other hand, it is a testament to how reckless the powers were. They were playing with fire in a room full of gasoline. The fact that we survived does not mean it was safe. It means we were lucky. Luck is not a strategy. We cannot rely on luck for the future. We need systems. We need transparency. We need communication. The Moscow-Washington hotline was a direct result of the crisis. It was an acknowledgement that speed was needed in communication. But is it enough? In the modern era, with cyber warfare and hypersonic missiles, the time for decision is even shorter. The margin for error is even smaller. The story of the U.S. destroyer and B-59 is a cautionary tale for the 21st century. It tells us that technology outpaces wisdom. It tells us that we must be vigilant. It tells us that peace is not the default state. It is a construct. It is something we must build and maintain. As the video concludes, remember the names, remember the ships, remember the date. October 27th, 1962. The USS Coney. The B-59. Vasily Arkhipov. Valentin Savitsky. These are not just names in a history book. They are the reason we are here. They are the variables that change the equation. When you look at the ocean, remember what lies beneath. Remember the steel tubes carrying warheads. Remember the men watching the screens. Remember the depth charges falling. And remember that the line between peace and war is thinner than we think. It is held by the choices of individuals. It is held by the courage to say no. It is held by the wisdom to pause. Let this story be a reminder. Let it be a warning. Let it be a call to action. We must do better. We must communicate better. We must understand better. Because the next time the depth charges fall, we might not be so lucky. The next time the argument happens in the control room, the outcome might be different. The stakes have not changed. The weapons are still here. The submarines still patrol. The destroyers still hunt. The only thing that can save us is us. The sun set on the Caribbean that day. The waves continued to roll. The ships moved on. The world continued to spin. But something had shifted. A realization had taken hold. The brink had been seen. The abyss had been glimpsed. And everyone who knew the truth stepped back from the edge. They stepped back because they had to. There was nowhere else to go. There was no victory in mutual destruction. There was only silence. The silence of a world without people. The silence of a planet recovering from fire. That silence was avoided, but the memory of it remains. It remains in the archives. It remains in the declassified documents. It remains in the stories of the survivors. And now it remains in this video, shared with you, so that you know, so that you understand, so that you can tell others. Because knowledge is the first step to prevention. Ignorance is the fuel of conflict. We cannot fight what we do not understand. We cannot prevent what we do not know. Now you know. Now you understand. The destroyer almost started the war. The submarine almost fired the shot. But humanity held on. For now. The technical dance of sonar and countermeasures that day was a preview of modern naval warfare. The Americans used variable depth sonar to penetrate the thermal layers of the ocean. The Soviets used silence and depth to hide. It was a technological duel. But the technology failed to convey intent. Sonar can tell you where a ship is. It cannot tell you what a captain is thinking. It cannot tell you if he is scared. It cannot tell you if he is bluffing. This is the limitation of machines. They deal in data, not meaning. Humans deal in meaning, and meaning is subjective. The meaning of a depth charge changed depending on who heard it. To the American, it was a message. To the Soviet, it was a weapon. This semantic gap is where wars start. Not in the weapons themselves, but in the interpretation of their use. Closing this gap is the work of diplomacy. It is the work of trust. It is the work of years. But it can be destroyed in seconds. One explosion, one misunderstanding, one moment of rage. That is all it takes. That is all it took on October 27th, and that is all it could take again. We must honor the restraint shown by both sides. It is easy to criticize in hindsight. It is easy to say they should have known better. But they were in the fog. They were acting on the information they had. The fact that they stopped is remarkable. The fact that the Americans did not sink the sub when it surfaced is remarkable. The fact that the Soviets did not fire when they were hunted is remarkable. It shows that even in the darkest moments, there is a thread of sanity. There is a voice that says, wait. There is a hand that stays the trigger. We must amplify that voice. We must support that hand. We must build systems that encourage restraint rather than escalation. We must reward diplomacy rather than aggression. The story of the destroyer and the submarine is not just a story of danger. It is a story of survival. It is a story of how close we came and how we pulled back. It is a story of hope, because if we pulled back then, we can pull back again. If we found peace in the chaos of the Cold War, we can find it in the conflicts of today. The tools are different, the players are different, but the choice is the same. War or peace, destruction or survival, fire or water. The choice is ours. The video ends here, but the story continues. It continues in every patrol, in every briefing, in every decision made by leaders around the world. You are part of this story. Your awareness matters. Your voice matters. Share this history. Talk about it. Understand the stakes. Because the more people who know how close we came, the harder it will be to let it happen again. The memory of Black Saturday must not fade. It must be a beacon, a warning light in the dark, blinking red, saying careful, saying think, saying wait. Let us heed that warning. Let us choose wisely. Let us choose life. The destroyer almost started the war, but we are still here. Let us keep it that way.